Greetings, friends, and welcome to our show this afternoon. I'm delighted to have with me Mark Stahlhut, uh, who was a former student of Walt Brueggemann's in the 1970s, 70 to 74, something like that, Mark.
Yes, yes, but actually I had contact with Walt, as we always called him, in the early 60s when he first came to the seminary. I was born and raised in St. Louis, and he came and led a Bible study at our church for adults. And that was the first contact that I recall with him.
So did you grow up was this an E&R church,
Yep,
tradition
yep,
church?
yep.
How early would he have been out in the congregations doing that kind of thing? Soon after he got to Eden?
Yeah, well, it had to be 61 or later. And I, let's see, I was gone by 66. So it had to be somewhere in that period. It was an evening Bible study once a week for, I think, 3 or 4 weeks.
So, Mark, it's great to have you with us. Tell me a little bit about what your experience, what was Eden like when you were there? What did you experience of Walt Brueggemann? What did you experience of other faculty? This was a great lineup of faculty there in the 60s and
Yeah,
70s in Eden.
yeah.
So just let's talk about your experience a bit.
Well, I came to Eden having known about it for all of my life because I was raised in the evangelical church as well. Like Walt, my father was an evangelical E&R minister. Like Walt, I had an older brother that I followed into the ministry. Like Walt, I went to Elmhurst College, the denominational school. So, but after that, the similarities end. So we had a common history. What Eden was like was it was the church school. If you were an E and R, and particularly an E, if you wanted to follow the traditional path, you went to Elmhurst College. And if you wanted to be a minister, you went to Eden Seminary. I wasn't certain I wanted to be a minister. I was certain I did not want to go to Vietnam. So the two kind of coalesced with going to Eden Seminary, and I came in January of 70, which was quite unusual because normally classes,
Mhm.
students start in September. I came in January because I thought if I waited till September, I would be drafted.
Mhm.
And I knew I did not want that to happen. So I came in January and was starting kind of half step off the pace because I was the only one who came in January. All the other students had been there starting in the prior September. So that was a little bit different experience for me to integrate myself into. Um,
What did you find when you arrived at Eden?
I found it was sort of familiar because the other part of it is my great uncle was Frederick Schrader, who was
Sure.
president of uh, Eden Seminary, and my first encounters with Eden Seminary were in the president's house when we'd go see Uncle Fred and Aunt Laura and have dinner with them when he was there. So I kind of knew Eden from the inside. I knew the territory, what the names of the buildings were. I knew the fish pond out in the courtyard, but I didn't really know anything of it in terms of an academic institution, except that my great uncle would complain sometime that he wished the students would pick up their beer cans and put them away instead of them being left around. He was really pretty much straight laced, right out of the old evangelical school, and occasionally he'd have some droll humor, but not much. But in terms of the school as an educational institution for me, it wasn't one that I sought out for any particular academic reason, other than the fact this was the school you went to if you wanted to be an E and R, particularly an E, coming from that tradition, minister. So I went.
And to what degree to what degree was Eden Seminary made up of largely E&R faculty and E&R students by the time you arrived? Was it still largely a culturally E&R place?
I would say among the faculty, I really don't know because I um, didn't know the denominational background of any of them, except when Doug Meeks came, which was when I was near leaving. I think I recall that he was Methodist or something like that. But the
Yeah.
others, I don't know what their background was, and it wasn't advertised. The students, I would say probably 50 to 60% were E&R. There were some Catholics, there were a lot of Methodists who were serving small congregations and going to seminary at the same time, which was a kind of a common practice for Methodists at that point in time, as there was no Methodist school nearby. The nearest one was probably in Chicago, which was 300 miles away from
Hmm.
St. Louis. So that was not something that was going to work for Methodist students who were serving congregations in rural Missouri or Southern Illinois.
So David Lohr kind of reacted to the idea that there were draft dodgers sitting around in Walt's classroom, and that Walt was kind of picking up on this, and it fed his prophetic imagination, or some of what he was concerned about, and some of what was stirring in the church at the time. Uh, you came to Eden to make sure you weren't drafted, or to
Right?
so how did you find Eden in terms of its concern about the war, lack of concern, and so on?
There was concern, and to pick up on one of the events that David talked about that I remember slightly differently, but the thrust of it is entirely the same. I came in January, and on May 4th is when Kent State happened.
Hmm.
That Monday,
Hmm.
I went and looked this up because I wasn't sure my memory was correct about this at all, but it was that Monday that was the day that the students were shot. And then that was, as David said, the classroom doors were chained shut, and there were no classes, and the students were involved in activities. We put together a flyer, for lack of a better term, about our closing of the classes at Eden Seminary, and we gave it out on the street corners. I can remember standing on, well, let's see, I guess it was Lockwood. Well, I can't remember if it's Lockwood or Bomport, but I think it was Lockwood, having these flyers in my hand, handing them out to drivers and passengers as they went by in their car. So there was a real sense of activism about it. And there was no, as I recall, no pushback from the faculty about this, that they may have thought that, but they didn't say it, that we should be about our business of educating people for the ministry, as opposed to we should be about what's going on in the world around us.
So they were, or they were not, when that statement you just made, where were the faculty on that?
I There was not a clear faculty statement.
Okay.
There was a sense, by virtue of the fact that no action was taken to remove the chains, which that they were symbolic chains. They were literally chains, but anybody could have clipped them off in 10
Yeah.
minutes if they wanted to. Nobody did. An interesting thing to me that relates to Walt on this, that the Thursday after, so 3 days later after Kent State happened, was Ascension Day. Eden Seminary had a long tradition of having Ascension Day softball games. There would be two games, the juniors versus the middlers, and then the seniors versus the faculty. And of course, everybody wanted to watch that one. That was the fun one. It was decided that year, I think, by the students without any consultation with the faculty, just unilaterally decided that there would be no Ascension Day softball games this year. And as I recall, the one person who was most upset was Walt Brueggemann, for a couple of reasons. Number one, I didn't ask him about this. This is just my sense of it. He liked to play ball, and he would definitely and always was out there playing ball. But secondly, and perhaps more importantly, on a theological basis, he thought life should go on even despite horrendous things happening.
Interesting.
You don't discontinue your life, you continue in life with that in mind and in hand, but you don't stop living.
Interesting. Interesting. Be interesting to see what he says about that
If he
reflection.
remembers, well, and
Uh,
I should
I
say
think
about
he'll remember.
all these things are my memory, which is it's very distant. And some of this was sort of passed on to me by other students. Some of it I actually witnessed. That was just a scuttlebutt at that point in time. The Walt was really upset that there were no softball games on Ascension Day.
Now, I've heard from other students that he was very aggressive on the basketball court.
Oh, yes.
And somebody just emailed me and said, and he and Doug Meeks were, you have to hear the story about Doug Meeks and Walt Brueggemann playing volleyball against the students.
Oh,
Now you're bringing up softball. So it sounds like he was a three-star athlete here or
well,
something like
I
that.
played basketball with him once or twice too. There were pickup games across the street at
Yeah.
Mercer College. And I remember going once and Walt's there along with these other students. And I didn't expect that. And so I thought, well, how do we play this? Do we play this as hard as we can? Or do we, kind of take it easy on the old guy? Or what do we do? And it was very clear to me quickly when he came driving by me and gave me an elbow in the ribs that I'll never forget that this was not a game for sissies, that this game was being played full bore, no holds barred. And that's just kind of how emblematic of how kind of Walt did everything, and no holds barred, full throttle, full speed ahead.
Including his theology, I guess,
Yeah.
and teaching. So what was he like in the classroom, Mark? You had him for classes?
Yeah. I had him for one class. And then I think I had him in what was called the core class, which was a combination of kind of sociological, theological, and historical mixed together into one class that all the students in that, for example, in the junior class, all were required to take it, and they took it together. So I had
I think he was responsible for putting that together even.
he could have been, as the
Yeah.
academic dean, I'm sure he had some say about it.
Yeah.
And I'm sure it wouldn't have happened without his approval. Whether it was his idea or not,
Yeah.
I don't know.
So you took that course with him. What else?
I also was in the wisdom class that David Lohr referred to. And by that point, that was my senior year. And what had happened by that point in time is Walt was a fabulous teacher. It was an event to sit in his class. And it was a happening as well as an educational event. He was dramatic. Nobody fell asleep in his class. And he was demanding as a professor as well. His workload was huge. He demanded 3 papers a semester. And they weren't one-pagers either. To the point where when I was a senior, I, along with some others who weren't interested in writing 3 papers, we decided we would audit his courses. And we would have the advantage of sitting in and hearing his incredible lectures, but not have to do all the work that was demanded by him. That was the wisdom class. Now, I don't know if David was auditing that or not. I know I was, because I wasn't going to do all that work.
So did Walt, did he know you all were auditing the courses?
Yeah. And he was getting a little bit upset about it. He was thinking that we were kind of freeloaders a bit, which we were. He was exactly right. And he never said anything to us directly, but we never asked him what he thought about that either.
So you remember the character. Do you remember the content of the courses?
Not directly, no. They were there obviously had to be an Old Testament one. Ironically enough, he was not teaching Jeremiah when I was in seminary. Lee Whiston, whom Walt has referred to, I read your book, was teaching Jeremiah at that point in time. And surprisingly enough, I don't think I even knew that Jeremiah was kind of Walt's real bailiwick until I read it in your book. I just thought, well, he's Old Testament. Clearly prophets were his thing. Genesis was his thing as well.
David Lohr was quite humorous when he said he spent the first few years of his life just preaching the prophets, Jeremiah and Isaiah, or
Yeah,
something, Jeremiah and Ezekiel.
right.
So did you end up becoming a pastor,
Yeah, yeah,
Mark?
perfect. And actually, ironically enough, I'm still serving a congregation.
Are you really
Yeah,
in
yeah.
the UCC?
American Baptist congregation. It's a
Okay.
unique situation where four of us ordained clergy are sharing a half-time position.
Wow.
This is the new shape of the church. We're a
Yeah.
very small congregation. Um, None of us want to do it half-time, but we're willing to do it eighth time. So that's kind of my situation now. And most people don't belong to any church. I
Right.
belong to two. I belong to the one of the United Church of Christ congregations in town, and I belong to the Baptist American Baptist Church as well. So it's a different situation.
So who are the other faculty you remember from your time at Eden?
Gene Worley, primarily. In your book, I see Walt talked about Alan Worley, and I also knew him because my father was a minister in St. Louis, and Alan Worley was kind of part of the social set of clergy that were very neighborly and had a lot of fellowship
Yeah.
time together. And Alan Worley was part of that. And Eugene Worley was too young then; he wasn't out of seminary yet. He was just kind of out and there when I got to Eden, and he was a great teacher as well. I compare him to Walt without the juice, in a sense. But I learned not to take anything away from Walt, but I learned as much from Gene Worley as I did from Walt.
Hmm.
And Gene Worley was New Testament,
Okay.
so it was a nice balance.
Yeah. How did you find that Eden prepared you for what you've done the rest of your life, or
Very
didn't it?
well, very well. Eden's reputation, as I saw it, was well. If you want to be a serious scholar, you would go to Union Seminary in New York,
Yeah.
or Yale, or Harvard,
Mhm.
somewhere like that. If you were just kind of a practitioner and just kind of want to be a minister and be a good minister, but you weren't going to be Reinhold Niebuhr or Richard Niebuhr, you Eden was perfectly fine. And I agree, Eden was perfectly fine. I've never found that I've been uh, put in a situation where I thought, oh, gee, I wasn't prepared nearly as well as these other people. I'm kind of behind here because of the school that I went to. Maybe because I didn't work as hard as I could have, but not because of the school.
As you look back and as an alumnus, when was there a shift in Eden's I mean, I hear a lot of alumnus or alumni talking about that Eden is not what it was when they were there. It's lost some direction. What kept it in? What grounded it? Kept it in its moorings while you were a student there? And when did that shift? If it did shift, and maybe it's in misinterpretation, misunderstanding.
I really have not kept in close contact with Eden since I graduated. I went back to a convocation, which was a spring event for clergy to come to, always the week after Easter, because clergy were exhausted by then and wanted to have a break.
Right.
I went to that for several years. When I lived in the area, I served a church near uh, Eden, about 70 miles away, for 4 years after seminary, and went back then. Then I went and moved to Wisconsin, where I've been since, and didn't go back since then. But when I was there, I think what kept its moorings was its historical nature in the
Mhm.
evangelical church. And it was still clearly a school of the evangelical church, even though the evangelical church per se anymore it had become E&R and it had become UCC. But it was the evangelical seminary. That was my understanding of what it was. And even though there was an ecumenical leadership and faculty there, it was it was still part of the evangelical tradition.
And as you were growing up, what did that mean to you? What did the evangelical tradition mean to you, Mark? What did you understand it as a taken for granted reality?
Well, obviously, it meant very different than what evangelical means commonly
Yeah.
in today's life. Uh, it meant Probably you were probably German. There was a good chance that you were part of that ethnic group that historically had been, and with a name like Stahlhut, it's if
Mhm.
you'd ask someone what branch of the UCC it came from, they could probably guess by my name that I came from the evangelical branch. That it was a strong place to be to prepare you for the future.
Meaning,
Meaning that you would know the history of your of where you'd come from. You would be prepared to live in the world as it was at the time. You would, for example, with the Kent State event that I talked about, that that was not out of character at
mhm.
seminary and would not have been out of character in any of the churches. I think we would be prepared well for crises like that.
Mhm.
And for, if you want to talk about our current political situation, I would call
Yeah,
it kind of a crisis as well.
yeah.
That we've been prepared for that. Nobody knows the answer, but we're not surprised. And we're not thinking like, well, I've never thought that anything possibly like this could happen or that the church would have anything to do with it. Of course, the church has to do with it.
Yeah. Yeah, that sounds like Walt. So you may say there was nothing we had in common afterwards, but that sounds
Well,
pretty Walter-like.
there was one event that reinforced this that happened at the end of my time at seminary when the Concordia Seminary, which was also in the St. Louis area, was having a purge. And
Yeah,
they
I was
were,
going to ask you about that, but go
yeah,
ahead. Go ahead.
they were having a purge, and they threw out their president for, I don't know, whatever reason, but we understood as being too liberal. And Teachin was his name. And I remember that there was a slogan then, no teaching, no learning. Um, Even though his name was spelled Tjetgen, I think, or something like that, but it fit rather well. And Eden was this is not at all out of character. Eden was very supportive, and we housed Seminix, which was
Hmm.
where the Missouri Synod Lutherans could come
Hmm.
and have their classes. We would lend them our building and let them use our building. And there was a demonstration. I didn't think about this much at the time, but I thought about it since in a lot that is really emblematic of Walt. We led a demonstration in downtown Webster Groves for whatever that's worth.
Hmm.
But leading the demonstration was Walt Brueggemann, who'd gone into chapel and taken the traditional brass cross that sits on almost every altar you've ever seen of a congregation that looks like it only belongs in church, and it's sort of kind of an ornament but also a symbol. Walt took that and embraced it close to his chest and led the procession with the cross, the the as some people might think, well, the irrelevant cross of worship. Not for Walt. The cross that
Hmm.
symbolized who the church was and what the church was, that's what led the procession. And that was as emblematic of who Walt
Yeah.
was as anything I can think of.
Yeah, that's interesting because I found in his archives a photograph of the students from Concordia coming over, and Walter as dean was welcoming them
Yep,
with open arms as they were
right.
coming.
Well, if he hadn't wanted them, I mean, as academic dean, it wouldn't have happened. So,
He tells the story of when he was well, it was in my book, but his father went to visit the Missouri Synod
right,
pastor, and
yeah.
he wanted to invite him in and so on. So this was said to feel sort of good. Uh,
Ironic sort of thing that he, with open arms, welcomes the rejected Missouri Synod Lutherans as
yeah, yeah,
ones
yeah,
who'd followed their rejected president.
yeah, 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 yeah.
And
Had to
there
feel a little
was,
bit good.
yeah, at that point in time, especially the Missouri Synod Lutherans were there were no Wisconsin Synod Lutherans that I knew of in Missouri. There are a lot of them here in Wisconsin, obviously, but the Missouri Synod Lutherans were the real conservative ones, and they were
Mhm.
kind of, this was pre-Vatican. Well, no, it was after Vatican II, but not long. That they were kind of, viewed with great suspicion, like Catholics had been pre-Vatican II, as almost the enemy, the
Yeah,
other, and certainly don't trust them. And they think they've got all the right answers. We know we don't, but that's the primary difference between the two of us. And we know they don't also, but they haven't figured that out yet.
Mark, you've been terrific. Anything else you want to add about your experience at Eden or
Uh,
Walt or any other faculty, students?
yeah, he there were a couple of words that just set Walt off
Hmm.
that he couldn't stand. He would say spiritual instead of spiritual. It was spiritual, which was clearly a derogatory term, and I couldn't figure out for a while why he was doing that. But eventually, it occurred to me that anything that kind of smacked of supernatural, otherworldliness, uh, of the nature of God like that, that somehow comes from out of the blue and has nothing to do with anything, he rejected. And another word that he would have nothing to do with, and it still bothers me, and my colleagues get upset with me, is the word soul, S-O-U-L.
Hmm.
Walt said, it's nephesh. It's not soul. It's not some disembodied spirit. It's the uniqueness of the human being. And he didn't want to have anything to do with spiritual or soul. Those were two words that just didn't work for him very well.
I just asked you if you remembered any content, and you said no, Mark. And here
Well,
we go. You've got stuff written down.
well, they're actually right. There was it wasn't content of a class, but it was
Yeah,
educational. We
yeah.
were the students, of course, always rebel against the faculty. At least we did. And when chapel was on Wednesday mornings, I think around 10 or 10:30, and it lasted for 15 minutes, maybe it was a half hour, I don't know. But the students would rebel a lot and wouldn't go, so we'd sit around and just kind of talk with each other. And there was one time just before chapel came that I don't know what room we were in, but Walt came in and he stood there and he said, I want you to know there's something important happening in chapel, and I think you should be there. And it was just as if Moses had said it from on high, or the clouds had parted and God had spoken it. And it wasn't about Walt was leading chapel that day. I never understood it that way. I understood it eventually over the years as he's talking about the community. We're
Hmm.
a community here. We need to be part of the community.
Hmm.
And when half of the community is kind of sitting around and just taking a break from class and having a cup of coffee, it's really hard to have a community here. That really grabbed me.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So it wasn't that there was something unique happening that day necessarily.
I don't think so.
It
No,
was just
I
that chapel
think
was
it was
important.
yeah, it wasn't about you should be in chapel today. It was about you should be in chapel. And it was a very clear not, it was not, well, you guys should think about going to chapel. It was you should be there. There's something important happening that you need to be part of.
Well, he had deep convictions, has deep convictions about community
Yep.
and about how community is created, the value of community, going to church as a place of community. Uh, and so that doesn't surprise me. That's very thanks for that. That's very much what I've learned from about Walter.
Yeah.
Anything else, Mark?
Oh, I could go on quite a while, but I do recall, and it shaped me to this day that he preached a sermon once. I guess it was in chapel. I don't know where else I would have heard it, but the place is irrelevant. It was entitled "Precious and Precarious," and
Hmm.
on 2 Corinthians chapter 4 about we have this treasure in clay jars, and I don't know how many times I've kind of, from what Walt said, used that reference, particularly at funerals, and
Hmm.
found it a very useful way of thinking about life and the importance of life, and yet the fragility of life, as he said, precious and precarious. And that really had a long term impact on me, as much as anything he ever said.
That's pretty powerful, Mark. Um, you don't remember if that was chapel or if that was
I suspect it was. I'm trying to think of it. It may have been perhaps an address he made as the academic dean. It
you know.
was an out and out sermon, at least as it was
Mhm.
not a class lecture. Although sometimes class lectures resembled sermons, this one wasn't. This was just a straightforward sermon, meditation, whatever you want to call it, that was incredibly powerful.
Well, thanks for sharing that, Mark. And anything else? I keep seeing you look at your notes, so I don't want to shut you down.
Well,
I don't want to shut you down
there
prematurely.
was one, you can edit this later. There was one chapel service I remember that actually I didn't go to this one, but I got told about it, that Walt was leading. And he led off by having the people assembled there, the seminary community, sing the hymn, "Take Time to Be Holy." And everybody sang it. And then as soon as the hymn was done, Walt absolutely ripped the hymn apart as being just ridiculous, that there's this compartment of life that's holy, and then there's this other compartment of life
Mm.
that, well, I guess if it's not holy, if that's holy over there, what are the other options? And that life is lived sort of, I guess you could say, sacred and secular or that way, but that just isn't how Walt viewed life at all. It was and is one thing, and you don't put God in the corner over there where you take time to be holy. That's not how life works. And that was, even though I wasn't there, that is as authentically Walt as anything I can think of as well.
Yeah, thanks again for that. He has taken and continues to take hymnody very, very seriously, uh, as a carrier of the theology of the church,
Mhm.
as a carrier of the theology of the community. And he told me his father had no time for what he called romantic hymns. Uh, these were hymns, if they were going to be romantic hymns, kind of gushy, mushy hymns about God, they could be sung on Wednesday nights only, I think he said, but not on Sunday morning. And so, he certainly got that clearly from his father, at least his sensitivity that there's something about the hymns that carries the ideology, the embodiment of the church.
Let me talk about one more hymn that,
Sure.
Walt, "A Mighty Fortress is Our God."
Uh,
Um, I'm not sure exactly what the context of this was, but I remember Walt saying this, that what exactly is the nature of God's fortress, and what is God's bulwark like? And I'm not sure how it was clear to me it was a serious thing, and a serious question. I thought it was, at the time, I thought it was a question that he was struggling with, that he didn't know the answer to. In retrospect, I thought it might have been something he was saying just for students to think about, and the nature of it. And I thought about it for many, 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 many years until I've arrived at my own conclusion about what that means. But I've often thought, whenever I sing this hymn, I think of Walt asking the question, "What is the nature of the fortress that God provides?" And I don't. It's one that sticks with me. There must have been many others, but there's just a few things that really stick with me.
are you open to sharing your conclusion about what the
Yeah,
fortress and bulwark of God
the
is?
fortress, a mighty fortress and a bulwark never failing, has to do with the presence of God, has
Mm.
not to do with the power of God, has not to do with the protection of God. It has to do with God never abandoning us. And that's the nature of the, if you want to call it protection, we're not alone. We're not abandoned. That's where I've come out on.
Mark, thank you. Thanks for being with us. Thanks for sharing those thoughts, the profound, the funny. You are humorous. You got this. Some of you come out of the tradition have this kind of dry sense of humor that just kind of catches me from time to time. So
Uh-huh.
thank you for sharing that. Thanks for sharing your memories. Thank you.
Thank
And
you.
I will send you this to look at, and then we'll make it public to our listeners.
Great. I'll enjoy getting that back from you.
Thank
Nice
you,
meeting
Mark.
you.
All right,
Oh,
blessings.
one question. How do you pronounce
Yeah,
your last name?
Carnegie.
Carnegie. I was going to go Carnegie, but I'm wrong. So
Yeah,
second
I grew
syllable.
up. It's Swiss German,
Oh,
and I've got Amish roots on all sides of the family. So it's one of the reasons I found this tradition deeply. It's very different than my tradition, but there's an awful lot of similarities.
We've
And
got, I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
it's just reawoken some things within me that have been important.
Come to Wisconsin. We've got a lot of Amish around here. When you ride the back roads, you got to watch out for the buggies.
Yeah, they're doubling in size every 20 years. Population,
Yeah.
they'll soon be everywhere, Mark. They'll soon
Yeah.
be everywhere.
Nice meeting you.
You too. Blessings. Bye
Take
bye.
care.